When a desperate Comanche widow approaches a grieving settler with the boldest proposal imaginable, "I need a husband, and you need warrior sons," their marriage of convenience becomes something neither expected in the unforgiving Wyoming Territory of 1867. But when her late husband's brother arrives with painted warriors to claim her child, will their fragile bond survive the ultimate test between two worlds? Blood stained the morning frost red. Ayanna crouched behind the twisted oak, her baby son pressed tight against her chest as his tiny fist grabbed at her leather dress. Down in the valley, smoke rose from what used to be her village. The smell of burning hide, and something worse, drifted up on the cold October wind of 1867 in the Wyoming Territory. Her people were gone, all of them. She had been gathering late berries when the soldiers came. Now she watched blue-coated men on horses ride away from the black remains of her home. They carried her husband's war shield tied to one of their saddles like a prize. Little Wolf made a soft sound, and she quickly put him to her breast to keep him quiet. Her hands shook as she counted the riders disappearing into the distance. 12 men. 12 men had destroyed everything she knew. The sun climbed higher, warming her back through her buckskin shirt. She had to move. Winter was coming, and she had nowhere to go. Her sister tribes were scattered to the wind. The reservation meant slow death by starvation. The mountains held only bears and bitter cold. That left one choice that made her stomach twist like a snake. The white settlement. Ayanna had seen it 3 times from the hills during hunting trips with her husband. Square wooden buildings that looked like boxes scattered on the prairie. People who wore heavy dark clothes even in summer heat. They called their town Clearwater, though she had never seen water there that ran clean. She gathered her few things, a knife, a pouch of dried meat, her grandmother's medicine bag, and the silver coin a trader had given her last spring. Everything else was ash now. The walk took most of the day. Little Wolf slept against her back in his cradle board, worn smooth by her grandfather's hands years before she was born. Her moccasins made no sound on the grass, but her heart drummed loud enough to wake the dead. As the sun began its slide toward the western mountains, she reached the hills that looked down on the settlement. Smoke rose from chimneys, and she could see people moving between buildings like ants around a disturbed hill. But one place caught her eye. A lone cabin set apart from the town, with fields that showed the brown stubble of harvested corn. A man worked near a small barn, loading hay onto a wagon, with movements that spoke of bone-deep tiredness. Even from this distance, she could see the slump of his shoulders. She had heard the women talking about him when they traded at the white man's store. Daniel McCready. His wife and little girl had been taken by Crow raiders 3 moons ago. The Crow had sold them to slave traders heading south, and no one expected to see them again. A man with nothing left to lose might be desperate enough to listen. Ayanna made camp in a stand of cottonwoods where she could watch the cabin. She chewed strips of dried buffalo meat and gave Little Wolf what milk she had. Tomorrow she would make the choice that would save them both or see them dead before winter's first snow. The night was long and full of wolves howling in the distance. When morning came, she painted her face with clay from the creek bed. Not war paint, the symbols her grandmother had taught her for protection and strength. She braided eagle feathers into her hair and put on her best dress, the one with shells sewn around the neck that had cost her husband 6 horses to buy. If she was going to bargain for her life, she would do it with dignity. The man was already working when she reached the edge of his property. Up close, she could see the fresh scar along his jaw, and the way his left hand shook slightly when he lifted heavy sacks. The Crow had hurt him badly before taking his family. She stood at the fence line and waited. It didn't take long. White men were always watching for danger on the frontier, and movement caught their eye like hawks spotting mice. He straightened slowly, one hand moving to the rifle leaning against his wagon. "You're on my land," he said. His voice carried across the yard like a stone thrown into still water. Ayanna lifted her chin and stepped forward. "Your land sits on bones of my ancestors, but I did not come to fight about dirt and grass." He blinked, clearly surprised that she spoke English. Most whites thought all Indians were ignorant savages who could only grunt and point. What do you want? To talk. About staying alive when winter comes. The man, Daniel, she remembered, studied her face for a long moment. His green eyes were the color of new grass, but pain had carved lines around them that made him look older than his years. Talk about what? About what we both need. She adjusted Little Wolf's weight on her back and felt him stir sleepily. You know who I am? Comanche, he said. Not a question. Yes, my husband died when your soldiers burned our village yesterday. The words came out flat and hard as iron. I have a son who needs to eat. You have land that needs defending. Daniel's grip tightened on his rifle, but he didn't raise it. Lady, I don't know what you think. I know you lost your woman and child to the crow. Ayanna stepped closer, close enough to see the fresh grief written in every line of his face. I know your neighbors whisper that you should leave this place. That living alone makes you weak. Easy prey. His jaw worked like he was chewing bitter medicine. What's that to you? Everything. She pulled Little Wolf around to her front, letting the man see her baby's face. I need a husband who can keep us alive through winter. You need sons who can help you work this land and fight for it when trouble comes. The silence stretched between them like a rope pulled tight. A hawk circled overhead, its cry sharp in the crisp morning air. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang, calling the townspeople to Sunday service. You're talking about marriage, Daniel said finally. I am talking about survival. Ayanna met his eyes without flinching. For both of us. Daniel McCready set down his rifle and rubbed his face with both hands, the gesture of a man pushed past his limits. Lady, you've got brass coming here like this, he said, but there was no anger in his voice, just exhaustion that went bone deep. But marriage? To a complete stranger? Strangers learn each other's ways, Ayanna replied. She unwrapped Little Wolf from his cradle board and held him where Daniel could see his face clearly. This is my son. He has seen 8 moons of life. His father was a war chief named Black Eagle, killed defending our people. The baby gurgled and reached toward Daniel with tiny fingers. Without thinking, the white man stepped closer, and Ayanna saw something soften in his expression. He's got your eyes, Daniel said quietly, but his father's spirit, strong and stubborn. She bounced Little Wolf gently, making him smile. What was your daughter's name? Pain flickered across Daniel's face like lightning. Emma. She was 4 years old, had her mother's yellow hair and laugh that could make flowers bloom. Tell me about your wife. Margaret. His voice went rough around the edges. Married her back in Illinois before we came west. She could make bread that tasted like heaven and sing lullabies that would calm the wildest colt. He looked away toward the hills. The crow took them while I was in town getting supplies. Came back to blood on the floor and hoofprints leading north. Ayanna studied his face, reading the guilt and rage and desperate love that still burned there. You followed them. Far as I could. Lost the trail in the Badlands. Daniel's hands clenched into fists. Spent 2 weeks searching before I had to come back. Winter was coming, and the horse was near dead. You did what you could. Sometimes the spirits choose who lives and who crosses over. We cannot fight that choice. Easy words from someone who wasn't there. But his tone held no real anger. Just the hollow ache of a man who had failed to protect what mattered most. Ayanna shifted Little Wolf to her hip and walked closer to the cabin. The building was solid, built to last through prairie storms and winter blizzards. A vegetable garden showed the brown stems of harvested plants, and she could smell the rich scent of composted earth. You know how to work the land, she observed. Learned from my father back in Illinois. He always said, dirt don't lie, you treat it right, it feeds you. Treat it wrong, and you starve. My people say the same thing, but with different words. She knelt and scooped up a handful of soil, letting it run through her fingers. This earth is good. It will grow corn and beans and squash together, the 3 sisters that make each other strong. Daniel watched her with curious eyes. You know farming? I know many things. How to make plants grow in bad ground. How to cure sickness with roots and leaves. How to preserve meat so it lasts through the hardest winter. She stood and dusted off her hands. how to fight when fighting is needed. And you'd teach me these things? I would share them with my husband. The word felt strange on her tongue, but she said it firmly, just as he would share his knowledge with his wife. A gust of wind rattled the barn door, and Daniel moved to secure it with practiced ease. Ayanna watched how he moved, careful and deliberate, favoring his left side where old wounds still pained him. A man who had learned to work around his hurts. The townspeople won't accept it, he said without looking at her. White man married to an Indian woman. They'll make life hard for both of us. Let them try. Ayanna's voice carried the edge of sharpened steel. I have survived soldiers and starvation, and the death of everything I loved. I will not be broken by whispers and cold looks. Daniel turned to study her face, seeing something there that made him nod slowly. No, I don't suppose you would be. Little Wolf began to fuss, and Ayanna put him to her breast, speaking soft Comanche words that made the baby settle. Daniel watched with an expression she couldn't quite read. I don't speak your language, he said. English is hard too, but I learned it. Words are just sounds, until they carry meaning. She looked up at him over Little Wolf's dark head. Do you want to learn? Maybe, if we... He trailed off, shaking his head. This is crazy. People don't just decide to get married because it makes practical sense. People do many things to stay alive. In my tribe, marriages were often arranged by families for good reasons, to bring peace between groups, to join strong bloodlines, to help both sides prosper. Ayanna shifted Little Wolf to her shoulder and patted his back gently. Love grows from respect and shared work, from facing hard times together and not breaking. And if it doesn't grow, then we have still saved each other's lives. That is worth something. Daniel was quiet for a long time, looking out at his fields and the distant mountains where snow already capped the highest peaks. Finally, he spoke. I've got debts in town, money owed for supplies and equipment. The bank's been patient because of what happened, but patience runs thin when winter comes. How much? $47. Might as well be 1,000. Ayanna reached into her medicine pouch and pulled out the silver coin, holding it up so it caught the sunlight. This is worth $20 to the right trader. I know where to find plants the townspeople will pay good money for, medicines they cannot get from their stores. You'd do that? Help pay my debts? Our debts, she corrected, if we are to be husband and wife. The word hung in the air between them, like smoke from a distant fire. Daniel studied her face, searching for something. Doubt, maybe, or deception. But Ayanna met his gaze steadily, her dark eyes clear and determined. There's something else, he said finally. Something you should know before you decide. Tell me. Daniel walked to the side of the cabin, where a simple wooden cross marked a small grave. This is where I buried what was left of them. Found some pieces. When I came back, his voice broke slightly. I visit here every morning. Talk to them like they're still listening. Ayanna followed him to the gravesite, noting the wildflowers someone had planted around the marker and the smooth stones arranged in careful patterns. You honor their memory. This is good. Some might say it's unhealthy, hanging onto ghosts. The dead deserve to be remembered. In my tribe, we speak the names of our ancestors so their spirits stay strong. She knelt beside the grave and placed her hand on the earth. Margaret, Emma, I will not try to replace them, but I will respect what they meant to you. Daniel's eyes filled with tears he quickly wiped away. Why are you doing this? Really? Ayanna stood and faced him, Little Wolf drowsing against her shoulder. Because we are both alone in a world that wants to destroy us. Because winter is coming, and neither of us will survive it without help. Because, she paused, searching for words in English to match the feelings in her heart. Because sometimes the spirits put people in each other's path for reasons we cannot see until later. And you think that's what this is? I think we will find out. She extended her free hand toward him. Will you try this thing with me, Daniel McCready? Will you be my husband, and let me be your wife? He stared at her outstretched hand for a long moment, and she could see the war playing out behind his green eyes, grief and fear, and desperate hope all tangled together like vines around a tree trunk. Finally, slowly, he reached out and took her hand in his. I reckon we're both crazy enough to try." The wedding ceremony lasted exactly 7 minutes and felt like stepping through a door into another world. Reverend Matthews had arrived that Tuesday morning with his traveling Bible and suspicious eyes, summoned by Daniel's awkward request for a quick service. The preacher's weathered face showed every one of his 60 years as he looked between the tall white farmer and the Comanche woman holding a baby. "This is highly unusual, Mr. McCready," the Reverend said, adjusting his wire spectacles. "Are you certain about this arrangement?" "As certain as a man can be about anything these days," Daniel replied, his Sunday shirt freshly washed and his hair still damp from the creek. Ayanna wore her finest dress, the one with shells and beadwork that caught the morning light like tiny stars. She had braided sweetgrass into her hair and painted a thin line of red clay across her cheekbones. Little Wolf gurgled contentedly in her arms, fascinated by the Reverend's shiny buttons. The ceremony took place beside the cabin, with the Henderson family serving as reluctant witnesses. Mrs. Henderson kept shooting worried glances at her husband, while their 12-year-old son Tommy stared at Ayanna with the open curiosity of youth. "Do you, Daniel McCready, take this woman to be your lawful wedded wife?" Reverend Matthews asked. "I do." Daniel's voice was steady, though Ayanna noticed his hands trembling slightly. "And do you—" The Reverend paused, realizing he didn't know her name. "Ayanna Crow Feather McCready," she said clearly, adding Daniel's surname with deliberate intention. "Do you take this man to be your husband?" "I do." The English words felt foreign but important, like a key turning in a lock. "Then by the power vested in me by the territory of Wyoming, I pronounce you husband and wife." No kiss followed, no joyful celebration, just awkward handshakes and Mrs. Henderson's forced smile as she offered congratulations that sounded more like condolences. After the witnesses left, Daniel and Ayanna stood in the sudden quiet of their new shared life, neither quite sure what came next. "I suppose you'll want to put your things in the cabin," Daniel said, running his hand through his hair. "Where do you want me to sleep?" Ayanna asked directly, causing Daniel to flush red as autumn leaves. "There's a small room off the kitchen. It's not much, but it's warm and private." She nodded, understanding the careful boundaries he was drawing. This marriage might be legal, but trust would take time to build. That will work fine. The first week passed in a dance of polite strangers learning each other's rhythms. Daniel rose before dawn to tend the animals and check his fields. Ayanna woke with Little Wolf's first cries and began each day by gathering eggs from the chickens, who seemed less afraid of her than most humans did. She cooked breakfast over the wood stove, not the open fire she was used to, but she adapted quickly. Cornbread with wild honey, eggs scrambled with herbs she found growing near the creek. Coffee strong enough to wake the dead, the way Daniel liked it. They worked side by side during the day, preparing for winter. Daniel taught her how to split firewood properly, showing her the technique for finding the wood's natural breaking points. She showed him how to smoke meat using willow bark and sage, creating jerky that would last through the coldest months. "My grandmother always said you can tell a person's character by how they treat plants and animals," Ayanna said one afternoon as they worked in the garden together. She was teaching him to harvest the last vegetables before the first hard frost. "What does that say about me?" Daniel asked, carefully digging around the potato plants. "You talk to your horse like he's family. You built a shelter for the chickens that's better than some houses. You water the flowers on your wife's grave every morning." She pulled up a perfect turnip and brushed the dirt from its purple skin. "It says you know how to love things properly." Daniel stopped digging and looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "What about you? What does it say?" "That I notice how you treat the things you care about," she smiled, the first genuine smile she'd given him since their wedding day, "and that I hope someday I might be one of those things." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of horses approaching fast. Daniel immediately reached for the rifle he kept propped against the fence post, while Ayanna scooped up Little Wolf from where he'd been playing in the dirt. 3 riders appeared over the hill, townspeople from Clearwater, their faces grim with purpose. Ayanna recognized them from her brief visits to the general store. Mayor Walsh, Sheriff Burke, and Tom Fletcher who owned the largest ranch in the area. "Daniel," Mayor Walsh called out as they rode into the yard, "we need to talk." "About what?" Daniel kept his rifle lowered but ready. "About your new situation." The mayor's eyes flicked to Ayanna with obvious distaste. "People in town are concerned." "Concerned about what exactly?" Sheriff Burke spoke up, his hand resting on his gun belt. "About having hostiles this close to civilized folks. About what kind of information might be getting passed along to raiding parties." Ayanna felt her temper flare like dry grass catching fire, but she kept her voice level. "I am not hostile. I am a wife and mother trying to keep her family safe." "That's what they all say," Tom Fletcher spat. "Right before they cut your throat in your sleep." Daniel stepped forward, his jaw tight with anger. "You've got about 10 seconds to apologize to my wife before I show you what hospitality looks like at the end of a rifle barrel." The three men exchanged glances, clearly not expecting such a strong defense. Mayor Walsh raised his hands in a gesture meant to be calming. "Now, Daniel, we're not here to cause trouble. We're here because we care about your welfare and the welfare of the community." "Since when do you care about my welfare?" Daniel's voice was sharp as winter wind. "When Margaret and Emma were taken, how many of you rode out to help me search? How many offered supplies or comfort or even a kind word?" Uncomfortable silence fell over the group. Ayanna watched the men's faces and saw guilt mixed with their fear and prejudice. "That was different," Sheriff Burke said finally. That was when I needed neighbors, and you all decided I was on my own." Daniel's rifle came up slightly. "Now I've found a way to rebuild my life, and suddenly you're concerned citizens?" "This woman could be spying for war parties," Fletcher insisted. "How do we know she's not here to scout our defenses?" "Because she's too busy keeping me from starving to death?" Daniel shot back. "Because she's teaching me how to preserve food and treat sick animals and survive the winter that's coming, whether you approve of my wife or not." Ayanna stepped forward. Little Wolf balanced on her hip. "I will make you a promise," she said, looking each man in the eye. "If raiders come to your town, Crow, Sioux, or any other tribe, you will know about it before they strike. I still have friends among my people who remember honor." "And why would you warn us?" Mayor Walsh asked suspiciously. "Because this is my home now too. Because my son will grow up here. Because some things matter more than old grudges." She shifted Little Wolf to her other hip. "But mostly because my husband asked me to be part of this community, and I keep my promises." The men sat their horses in silence, weighing her words. Finally, Sheriff Burke nodded grudgingly. "We'll be watching," he said. "I'd expect nothing less," Ayanna replied coolly. After the riders left, Daniel leaned his rifle against the cabin wall and sat heavily on the porch steps. Ayanna joined him, Little Wolf playing between them with wooden blocks Daniel had carved from scraps. "That won't be the last visit," Daniel said. "I know." Ayanna pulled her shawl tighter against the cooling air. "Are you having second thoughts?" "About marrying you?" "No." His answer came quickly, surprising them both. "About staying here. Maybe." "Where would we go?" "Oregon Territory, California. Somewhere people don't know our history." He picked up one of Little Wolf's blocks and turned it over in his hands. "Start fresh. Running away doesn't solve problems, it just moves them to new places." Ayanna watched her son stack blocks with intense concentration. "Besides, you can't leave Margaret and Emma." Daniel's hands stilled. "What do you mean?" "Their grave is here. Their memories live in this place. If you leave, you lose the last connection to them." She touched his arm gently. "I won't ask you to choose between honoring your past and building our future. And if the townspeople make life impossible, then we make life impossible for them in return." Her smile was sharp as a knife edge. "I didn't survive the destruction of my entire world to be intimidated by shopkeepers and cattle ranchers." Daniel looked at her with something like admiration. "You're tougher than you look." "I have to be." For him, she nodded toward Little Wolf, who had successfully built a tower of 3 blocks and was clapping in delight. "For us." As if responding to her words, the baby looked up and reached toward Daniel with chubby fingers. Without thinking, Daniel picked him up and settled him on his lap, earning a gurgling laugh. "He's getting attached to you. Ayanna observed. Good. Daniel bounced Little Wolf gently, making him giggle. A boy needs a father figure, even if that figure is just learning how to be a decent husband. You're learning fast. Ayanna leaned against his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him. We both are. The first snow began to fall as they sat together on the porch, watching the flakes drift down like tiny white feathers. Winter was coming, and with it, all the challenges they had yet to face. But for the first time since her world burned, Ayanna felt something she had almost forgotten how to feel. Hope. The blizzard hit on the 4th day of November like a wolf pack descending on wounded prey. Ayanna woke to the sound of wind howling around the cabin walls and snow hissing against the windows. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees overnight, and frost covered everything inside that wasn't near the fire. Little Wolf shivered in his cradle, despite the extra blanket she'd piled on him. Daniel, she called, wrapping a heavy coat around her shoulders. No answer came from his room. Panic fluttered in her chest like a trapped bird as she hurried to the front door and pushed it open against the driving snow. The storm was a white wall that swallowed everything beyond 10 feet from the cabin. Daniel, she shouted into the wind. A muffled response came from the direction of the barn, barely audible over the storm's roar. Relief flooded through her as she saw a dark figure moving through the snow, leading the milk cow toward shelter. He burst through the door 10 minutes later, covered in snow and shaking with cold. Ice crystals clung to his beard, and his lips were blue beneath his mustache. Storm came faster than expected, he gasped, stamping snow off his boots. Had to get the animals secured before we lost them. Ayanna was already moving, stoking the fire and putting coffee on to heat. How long will it last? Could be days, maybe a week. Daniel peeled off his frozen outer clothes and hung them near the fire to dry. Good thing we prepared. They had indeed prepared. The root cellar was stocked with preserved vegetables, smoked meat, and bags of cornmeal. The cabin held enough firewood to last a month, and they had moved the chickens into a shelter attached to the barn where they'd stay warm and keep laying eggs. But being trapped in a small space for days would test their still fragile partnership in ways neither had considered. The first day passed quietly enough. They took turns feeding the fire and checking on the animals during brief breaks in the storm. Ayanna cooked hearty stews that filled the cabin with rich, savory smells, while Daniel worked on repairing harnesses and sharpening tools. Little Wolf crawled around the cabin floor, babbling to himself and getting into everything. He had learned to pull himself up on furniture and was constantly trying to grab things from tables and shelves. He's going to be walking soon, Daniel observed, watching the baby cruise along the edge of the kitchen table. Too soon, Ayanna said, swooping down to rescue a wooden spoon from Little Wolf's determined grasp. Walking babies get into twice as much trouble. Was I this much work when I was little? Little Wolf asked in perfect English, causing both adults to stare at him in shock. The moment stretched out like honey poured from a jar before they both realized the voice had come from outside. Through the frosted window, they could see a small face pressed against the glass. Tommy Henderson, Daniel muttered, hurrying to open the door. The 12-year-old stumbled inside, bringing a swirl of snow and wind with him. His face was red with cold, and his coat was crusted with ice. What in blazes are you doing out in this storm? Daniel demanded, helping the boy out of his frozen outer clothes. Pa sent me, Tommy gasped, accepting the cup of hot coffee Ayanna pressed into his hands. Ma's real sick. Been burning with fever for 2 days. Pa's scared she might, you know. Ayanna was already moving toward her medicine bundle. What are her symptoms? Hot skin, but she's shaking like a leaf. Can't keep food down. Keeps talking about things that aren't there. Tommy's young face was tight with worry. Pa tried the remedies from town, but nothing's helping. Sounds like winter fever, Ayanna said, sorting through her collection of dried herbs and roots. I can help, but we'll have to wait for the storm to pass. Can't wait that long, Tommy said desperately. Pa says if she don't get better soon. Daniel and Ayanna exchanged glances. They both knew what the boy couldn't bring himself to say. Mrs. Henderson might not survive another 2 days of high fever. I can make it to their place, Ayanna said quietly. In this storm? That's suicide, Daniel shook his head firmly. We'll wait for a break in the weather. There won't be a break. Not for days. Look at the sky. She pointed toward the window where snow continued to fall in thick, relentless sheets. This is a killer storm. It won't stop until it's ready. Then we're all stuck. No, I know how to travel in snow. My father taught me when I was younger than Tommy. Ayanna began packing her medicine bundle with quick, efficient movements. Mrs. Henderson helped witness our wedding. She treated me with kindness when others showed only suspicion. I will not let her die if I can prevent it. Daniel caught her arm as she reached for her heaviest coat. Ayanna, please, if something happens to you out there. She turned to face him, seeing something in his green eyes that made her heart beat faster. Not just concern for a useful partner, but genuine fear of losing her. You care about what happens to me, she said softly. Yes. The admission seemed to surprise him. More than I expected to. Then trust me to come back to you. She touched his cheek gently. I survived the destruction of my world. I can survive a snowstorm. The journey to the Henderson farm was a nightmare of white blindness and cutting wind. Ayanna wrapped herself in layers of fur and leather, with strips of cloth tied around her eyes to prevent snow blindness. She followed fence lines when she could find them, and pure instinct when she couldn't. Twice she almost gave up, her strength flagging in the deep drifts, and her hands going numb despite her thick mittens, but each time she thought of Mrs. Henderson's kind smile and Tommy's frightened face, and forced herself to keep moving. The Henderson cabin was a golden beacon in the storm when she finally spotted its windows. She stumbled to the door and pounded on it with fists she could no longer feel. Mr. Henderson opened the door, his face a mask of shock and relief. Ayanna, good Lord, how did you make it through this storm? Stubbornness, she gasped, stumbling inside. Where is she? Mrs. Henderson lay in the main bedroom, her face flushed with fever, and her breathing shallow and rapid. She tossed restlessly under heavy quilts, muttering words that made no sense. Ayanna went to work immediately, brewing teas from willow bark and echinacea, creating poultices from herbs she had gathered the previous autumn. She bathed Mrs. Henderson's fevered skin with cool water and got small sips of medicine between her cracked lips. For 2 days, she fought death for the woman's life. She slept in brief snatches, waking to check her patient's condition and adjust treatments. Mr. Henderson hovered anxiously, while Tommy helped by keeping the fire going and preparing food that Ayanna barely had time to eat. On the 3rd morning, Mrs. Henderson's fever broke. Where am I? The woman whispered, her voice weak but clear. You're home, Ma, Tommy said, tears streaming down his face. Ayanna saved you. She came through the storm to help. Mrs. Henderson turned her head slowly to look at Ayanna, who was slumped in a chair beside the bed, exhausted but watchful. You risked your life for me, Mrs. Henderson said quietly. You were kind to me when kindness was rare, Ayanna replied. That means something. The storm finally passed on the 4th day, leaving behind a world transformed by 3 feet of snow. Daniel appeared at the Henderson farm before noon, leading his horse through the deep drifts and carrying supplies for the return journey. I was starting to think I'd have to dig you out come spring, he said when Ayanna opened the door. Did you doubt I would return? Every minute of every day. He pulled her into his arms, not caring who saw the gesture. Don't ever scare me like that again. I can't promise that. Life is dangerous, and sometimes we have to take risks for the people we care about. She leaned into his warmth, feeling the solid reality of him after days of fighting for another's life. But I will always fight to come back to you. The ride home was slow but peaceful, with Little Wolf bundled against Daniel's chest and Ayanna riding behind him on the patient horse. The world around them sparkled like diamonds in the bright winter sun, beautiful and deadly and pristine. The town will hear about what you did, Daniel said as their cabin came into view. Saving Mrs. Henderson will change some minds about you. Will it change yours? Ayanna asked. My mind changed weeks ago, he replied. My heart's been slower to catch up. And now? Daniel pulled the horse to a stop in front of their cabin and turned in the saddle to look at her. His green eyes were warm and clear, free of the shadows that had haunted them since their first meeting. "Now I think I'm falling in love with my wife," he said simply. Ayana felt her own heart skip like a stone across water. "Good," she said, smiling, "because I've been falling in love with my husband for days." Little Wolf chose that moment to wake up and babble something that sounded remarkably like home, causing both adults to laugh. "Yes," Ayana said, looking at the cabin where smoke rose from the chimney into the clear blue sky. "Home." War paint and thundering hooves shattered the spring morning like glass. Ayana dropped the basket of eggs she'd been collecting and pressed herself against the chicken coop wall as 5 Comanche warriors rode hard toward the cabin. Their horses' breath steamed in the cool May air of 1868, and war cries echoed across the valley like the screams of hunting eagles. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she recognized the lead rider, Running Bear, her first husband's brother, his face painted with black and red stripes that meant he had come for blood or justice. Behind him rode warriors she knew from childhood, Stonewolf, Broken Arrow, and 2 young men whose names she couldn't recall but whose anger burned bright as prairie fire. Daniel emerged from the cabin with his rifle, Little Wolf toddling beside him on unsteady legs. At 18 months old, her son had learned to walk during the winter months, and now he followed Daniel everywhere like a faithful puppy. "Ayana," Daniel called, his voice tight with controlled fear. She stepped out from behind the coop, straightening her spine and lifting her chin in the proud way her grandmother had taught her. If death was coming, she would meet it with dignity. Running Bear pulled his spotted pony to a halt 20 feet from the cabin porch, his dark eyes scanning the scene before him. He saw the vegetable garden, where corn and beans grew in neat rows. He saw the smoke rising from the chimney and the wash hanging on the line. He saw Daniel's protective stance and Little Wolf's curious stare. Most importantly, he saw Ayana wearing a blue calico dress instead of traditional buckskin, her hair braided in the white woman's style. "Sister," Running Bear said in Comanche, his voice carrying across the yard like winter wind, "you have forgotten who you are." "I have become who I need to be," Ayana replied in the same language, walking slowly toward the mounted warriors. She kept her hands visible and her movements calm, though her pulse raced like a rabbit fleeing wolves. "You wear their clothes, live in their square houses, let their man touch you." Running Bear's lip curled with disgust. "You have brought shame on the memory of Black Eagle." Behind her, Ayana heard Daniel take a step closer, though she had warned him never to interfere if her people came calling. Little Wolf babbled something in his mixture of English and Comanche, drawing sharp looks from the warriors. "Black Eagle died defending our village from soldiers," Ayana said firmly. "He would want his son to live, not die for the pride of dead men. His son should grow up knowing the warrior's way, not playing with chickens and learning the white man's weakness." Stonewolf spoke for the first time, his scarred face grim with disappointment. "His son will know both ways," Ayana countered. "He will be strong enough to walk in 2 worlds." Running Bear dismounted in one fluid motion, his moccasins silent on the packed earth. He was a tall man, lean and dangerous, with a kind of coiled energy that reminded Ayana of rattlesnakes ready to strike. "Show me this strength," he demanded. "Show me how your white husband has made you warrior-wise." The challenge hung in the air like smoke from a signal fire. Ayana understood what he was really asking. This wasn't about Little Wolf or her choice to marry Daniel. This was about proving she was still Comanche at heart, still worthy of the blood that flowed in her veins. "Daniel," she said in English, not turning around, "take Little Wolf inside." "Ayana, I'm not leaving you alone with—" "Go, now." Her voice carried the authority of a war chief's daughter. "This is not your fight." She heard his reluctant footsteps and the cabin door closing, though she knew he would be watching through the window with his rifle ready. The thought gave her comfort, even as she prepared to face her past. Running Bear drew his knife, not to threaten, but to test. The blade was beautiful, forged from white man's steel but decorated with traditional beadwork and eagle feathers. He tossed it point first into the ground between them. "If you are still one of us, you remember the games of our childhood," he said. "Prove your hands are still quick and your eyes still sharp." Ayana smiled for the first time since the warriors arrived. She did indeed remember the knife games, contests of speed and skill that had taught young Comanche to be fast and fearless. She had often beaten boys twice her size, much to their embarrassment and her grandmother's pride. She pulled her own knife from her belt, smaller than Running Bear's but just as sharp, its handle worn smooth by years of use. With practiced ease, she began the ancient pattern, blades spinning between her fingers, tossed and caught in increasingly complex sequences, the steel flashing in the morning sunlight. The warriors watched in silence as she performed movements that required perfect timing and absolute confidence. One mistake would mean cut fingers, or worse. But Ayana's hands moved like they had minds of their own, muscle memory guiding every catch and throw. Finally, she caught Running Bear's knife from the ground and spun both blades in a figure-8 pattern that ended with both points buried in a fence post 20 feet away. The throw had taken less than 2 seconds and landed both knives within inches of each other. "My hands remember," she said simply. Running Bear nodded slowly, respect replacing some of the anger in his eyes. "Your skills remain sharp, but what of your heart? What of your loyalty to the people who raised you?" "My loyalty is to keeping my son alive and strong." Ayana walked to the fence post and pulled out both knives, returning Running Bear's to him handle. "First, the old ways are beautiful, but they cannot stop bullets or prevent starvation. Little Wolf needs new skills for a changing world. And this white man? What has he given you besides a roof and food?" The question was more complex than it sounded. Ayana thought of the long winter nights when Daniel had taught her to read English words from his wife's books. Of the mornings when she had shown him how to track deer and identify edible plants. Of the gradual warmth that had grown between them, built on shared work and mutual respect. "He has given me partnership," she said finally. "Not ownership, not protection, but true partnership. He listens to my knowledge and shares his own. He does not try to make me into something I am not." "Pretty words," Stone Wolf said with a sneer. "But words are wind. What happens when his people turn against you? What happens when soldiers come seeking revenge for old raids? Then we face those troubles together." Ayana sheathed her knife with a firm motion, as husband and wife should. Running Bear studied her face for a long moment, reading the determination there. Finally, he spoke again, but this time his words carried the weight of formal declaration. "Little Wolf is blood of our blood, born of warriors and chiefs. When he has seen 12 summers, we will return. If he chooses to come with us and learn the old ways, you will not stop him. If he chooses to stay with the whites, we will honor his decision, but the choice must be his alone." Ayana felt her heart clench like a fist around the words. 12 summers seemed both impossibly far away and terrifyingly close. "And if I refuse? Then we take him now, and you never see him again." Running Bear's voice was flat as winter stone. "Choose wisely, sister." The silence stretched taut as a bowstring while Ayana weighed her options. She could fight, but 5 warriors would overwhelm her easily. She could run, but they would track her down within days. Or she could trust that 10 years of love and teaching would be enough to help her son choose wisely when the time came. "I agree," she said finally. "When Little Wolf has 12 summers, he may choose his path freely." Running Bear nodded and remounted his horse. "Then we will see what kind of man you and your white husband raise. Pray that you teach him wisdom along with strength." The warriors wheeled their horses and rode away as suddenly as they had come, leaving only dust and hoofprints to prove they had ever been there. Ayana stood alone in the yard until the sound of their horses faded into the distance. Daniel emerged from the cabin with Little Wolf in his arms, his face pale but his jaw set with determination. What did they want? "To remind me who I used to be," Ayana said, watching her son reach for her with chubby hands, "and to see who I've become." "Are they coming back?" "In 10 years. She took Little Wolf and held him close, breathing in his sweet baby scent. "They want him to choose between worlds when he's old enough to understand what that means." Daniel was quiet for a moment, processing the implications. "And you agreed?" "I had to. It was that or lose him today." Ayana looked up at her husband, seeing the love and fear warring in his green eyes. "We have 10 years to show him that he can be proud of both his heritages. 10 years to prove that strength comes in many forms. What if he chooses them? Then we will have raised a son who knows his own mind and follows his own heart. She managed to smile despite the tears threatening to fall. That's all any parent can hope for. Little Wolf babbled something that sounded like Papa and reached for Daniel, who took him with hands that shook slightly. The sight of her white husband holding her Comanche son with such obvious love sent warmth through Ayanna's chest, despite the morning's upheaval. 10 years, Daniel said quietly. 10 years, she agreed. Let's make them count. As they walked back toward the cabin together, Ayanna noticed something that made her steps falter. In the soft earth where Running Bear's horse had stood, clearly visible hoofprints formed a pattern she recognized from childhood, the sign her people left to mark sacred ground. Her brother-in-law had given his blessing to their strange family, even if he couldn't bring himself to say the words aloud. The town meeting felt like walking into a den of angry wolves, but Ayanna held her head high as she followed Daniel through the crowded schoolhouse. It was August 1868, 3 months after Running Bear's visit, and the citizens of Clearwater had gathered to discuss what they called the Indian problem. Word had spread about the warriors who had come to the McCready farm, and fear had rippled through the settlement like wildfire through dry grass. Every seat was filled, and more people stood along the walls. Ayanna recognized most faces. Mrs. Henderson, who nodded kindly, Mayor Walsh, whose expression remained carefully neutral, Tom Fletcher, whose hatred burned bright as forged coals. The murmur of voices died to whispers as they entered, then to complete silence. "Take a seat anywhere you can find one," Mayor Walsh called from the front of the room, though his tone suggested he'd rather they leave entirely. Daniel guided Ayanna to 2 empty chairs near the back, his hand resting protectively on her elbow. Little Wolf stayed home with Mrs. Henderson's teenage daughter, sparing him from witnessing what was likely to be an ugly confrontation. "Folks," Mayor Walsh began, rapping his gavel on the makeshift podium, "we're here to discuss recent events and their impact on our community's safety." Tom Fletcher jumped to his feet before the mayor could continue. "Recent events? You mean the war party that rode right up to McCready's door bold as brass? That's what we're here about?" Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Ayanna felt dozens of eyes fixed on her like rifle sights, but she kept her expression calm and dignified. "From what I understand," Mayor Walsh said carefully, "no violence occurred during that visit." "No violence yet," Fletcher shot back. "But what about next time? What happens when they come back with 50 warriors instead of 5? "They won't," Ayanna said quietly, but her voice carried clearly in the tense room. Fletcher whirled to face her, his face red with anger. "And how exactly do you know that, Mrs. McCready? Got some special insight into the savage mind?" Daniel started to rise, but Ayanna touched his arm to keep him seated. She had expected this confrontation and prepared for it. Standing slowly, she faced the room full of hostile faces. "I know because I know them," she said simply. "The leader was my late husband's brother. He came to see his nephew and to judge whether I was raising the boy properly. He found what he needed to see." "Which was what?" Mrs. Patterson called from the middle of the room. "That Little Wolf is healthy and happy and learning to be strong in both white and Comanche ways." Ayanna met the woman's eyes directly. "That he has a father who loves him and a community that accepts him." "Accepts him?" Fletcher laughed harshly. "Lady, most folks here wouldn't spit on you if you were on fire." "Tom Fletcher, that's enough," Mrs. Henderson said sharply, rising from her seat. "This woman risked her life to save mine during the blizzard. She's earned the right to be heard with respect." A few voices murmured agreement, but Fletcher wasn't finished. "One good deed doesn't erase what she is. Doesn't change the fact that she's probably been feeding information to hostiles about our defenses, our numbers, our weaknesses." "What information would that be?" Daniel asked, standing to face Fletcher directly. "That we've got 23 men of fighting age? That our walls are made of wood and our guns are mostly hunting rifles? Any fool can see that just by riding through town. The point is, you're scared," Ayanna interrupted, her voice cutting through Fletcher's bluster like a sharp knife. "You're all scared, and you want someone to blame for that fear." Someone who looks different, speaks different, comes from the people you've been taught to hate. The room erupted in angry voices, but Ayanna continued speaking, raising her voice to be heard above the chaos. I understand your fear. I lived through the destruction of my village. I watched soldiers kill my husband and burn everything I loved. I know what violence looks like from both sides. Gradually, the shouting died down as people strained to hear her words. But I also know something else, she continued. I know that peace comes from understanding, not from hatred, from building bridges instead of walls, from teaching children to see each other as human beings instead of enemies. Pretty words, Fletcher said with a sneer. But what happens when your warrior friends decide they want our land, our cattle, our women? Then I will stand with my husband and my neighbors to defend this place, Ayanna replied without hesitation. Because this is my home too now. This is where my son is growing up. This is where I've chosen to build my life. Sheriff Burke spoke for the first time. And if we're supposed to believe that, Mrs. McCready, maybe you could prove it. How? There's been talk of Sioux raiding parties moving through the territory. If you hear anything from your contacts about planned attacks, you'll share that information with us? Ayanna nodded slowly. If I learn of threats to this community, you will know about them. I promise you that. Promises from a squaw don't mean much, Fletcher muttered, but several people shushed him. Mayor Walsh rapped his gavel again. I think we've heard enough opinions for one evening, unless there are any formal motions to consider. I have a motion, Mrs. Camp, Henderson said, rising once again. I move that we officially welcome the McCready family as full members of this community, with all the rights and responsibilities that entails. The silence that followed was deafening. Ayanna felt her heart hammering as she waited to see who would speak for or against the motion. I second it, came a voice from the front. To everyone's surprise, it was young Tommy Henderson, now 13 and tall for his age. Mrs. McCready saved my ma's life. That makes her family in my book. More voices began to speak up. The blacksmith, whose horse Ayanna had healed with her herbal knowledge. The widow Morrison, whose infected wound had responded to Ayanna's poultices. Even old Pete, the barkeeper, who had grown fond of little Wolf's bright smile during their visits to town. But an equal number remained silent or spoke against the motion. The vote, when it came, was closer than Ayanna had dared hope. 12 in favor, 16 against, with several abstentions. Motion fails, Mayor Walsh announced. But I think it's fair to say this community is evolving in its views. As people began to file out of the schoolhouse, Fletcher stopped beside Ayanna's chair. His voice was low and menacing as he spoke. This isn't over. Mark my words. You and your breed will bring nothing but trouble to decent folks. Daniel stepped between them, his hand resting on his gun belt. Tom, you've said your piece. Now move along before you say something you'll regret. Fletcher looked like he wanted to continue the argument, but the sight of Daniel's determined face and the sheriff's watchful eyes made him think better of it. He stomped out of the building, muttering under his breath. That man will be trouble, Ayanna said quietly as they walked home under the starlit sky. Let him try, Daniel replied. We've got friends now, even if we've got enemies too. Mrs. Henderson's motion was brave. So was your speech. I was proud of you tonight. Daniel took her hand as they walked, their fingers intertwining naturally. You faced down a room full of anger and fear with nothing but truth and dignity. My grandmother always said that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what needs to be done despite the fear. Ayanna squeezed his hand gently. I was terrified in there. Couldn't tell. You looked like a queen addressing her subjects. They walked in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of crickets and distant coyotes. The moon was nearly full, casting silver light across the prairie that stretched endlessly in all directions. Do you think we'll ever be fully accepted here? Ayanna asked, as their cabin came into view. By some people, yes. By others, probably never. Daniel opened the gate to their yard, holding it for her to pass through. But I've learned something important since we got married. What's that? Acceptance from others matters less than accepting yourself, and building a life with people who see your worth, He stopped walking and turned to face her in the moonlight. I see your worth, Ayana, every day, in 100 different ways. And I see yours. She reached up to touch his cheek, feeling the scratch of his beard against her palm. We're building something good here, Daniel. Something worth fighting for. Even if it's harder than either of us expected? Especially then. She smiled, thinking of little Wolf sleeping peacefully in his crib, dreaming whatever dreams 18-month-old boys dreamed. The best things always are. As they climbed the porch steps together, Ayana felt a deep sense of rightness settle over her like a warm blanket. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of their resolve and their love. But tonight, they were simply husband and wife coming home to their child and their life together. It was enough. More than enough. It was everything. Fire and screaming shattered the peaceful dawn of September 1877, 10 years after Ayana first approached Daniel's homestead with her desperate proposal. Little Wolf, now calling himself John Wolfe McCready at school but still howling wind when alone with his mother, bolted upright in his bed as the sound of gunshots echoed across the valley. At 11 years old, he had grown tall and lean like his Comanche father, but his green eyes came from the man who had raised him. Ma! Pa! He shouted, scrambling from his room as smoke began seeping under the front door. Ayana was already moving, her hair loose around her shoulders and her nightgown hastily covered by a heavy coat. She grabbed the emergency pack they always kept ready: water, dried food, ammunition, and the sacred items from her grandmother that she would never leave behind. The barn's on fire, Daniel said grimly, returning from a quick look outside. His face was streaked with soot, and his rifle hung ready in his hands. Whoever did this is long gone, but the flames are spreading fast. Through the window, John Wolfe could see their neighbors' properties dotting the landscape, some showing lights as people woke to the commotion, others remaining dark and silent. The Henderson farm, their closest ally, was too far away to help in time. Tom Fletcher, Ayana said, her voice flat with certainty. This has his mark written all over it. The escalating tension had been building for months. Fletcher's hatred had grown like poison in a wound, fed by whiskey and the support of men who shared his views. 3 weeks ago, he had publicly accused Ayana of providing information to a Sioux raiding party that had struck a ranch 50 miles north. The accusation was false, but it had given new ammunition to those who wanted the McCready family gone. We can't prove it was him, Daniel said, though his tone suggested he agreed with his wife's assessment. We don't need proof right now. We need to save what we can and get out before the fire reaches the house. Ayana was already stuffing precious items into a canvas bag, the family Bible Daniel's mother had given him, the silver dollar she earned selling her herbal medicines, the wooden horse Daniel had carved for John Wolfe's 3rd birthday. The smoke was getting thicker, making them all cough as they worked frantically to gather essentials. John Wolfe ran to his room and grabbed his most treasured possessions, the bow Daniel had made him for his 8th birthday and the war lance his uncle Running Bear had given him during a visit 2 summers ago. The animals, John Wolfe said suddenly, remembering their small herd of cattle and the chickens that provided eggs for trading in town. Already loose, Daniel replied. Opened all the gates first thing. They'll scatter, but at least they'll survive. Outside, the barn was fully engulfed, flames reaching toward the star-filled sky like angry fingers. The heat was intense even at a distance, and sparks danced on the wind like deadly fireflies. Their plow, their winter feed, their extra tools, everything stored in the barn was already lost. The house will be next if the wind doesn't change, Ayana observed, watching the direction of the sparks with practiced eyes. We have maybe 20 minutes. They worked in desperate silence, loading their wagon with what they could carry. Blankets, cooking pots, Daniel's carpentry tools, Ayana's medicine supplies, and enough food to last several days. Everything else, the furniture Daniel had built by hand, the curtains Ayana had sewn from precious fabric, the children's toys and books, would have to be abandoned. As they finished loading, the sound of approaching horses made them all freeze. 3 riders appeared out of the darkness, their faces invisible in the shadows but their intentions clear from the way they sat their mounts. "Thought you might need some help," called a familiar voice. Sheriff Burke rode into the circle of firelight, followed by 2 deputized townsmen. His expression was grim but determined. "Sheriff," Daniel said, surprise and relief evident in his voice. "What brings you out here?" "Got a report of suspicious activity. Came to investigate." Burke's eyes took in the burning barn and the loaded wagon. "Looks like someone's trying to run you folks off your land." "Any idea who?" Ayanna asked, though they all knew the answer. "Got my suspicions, but suspicions don't hold up in court." Burke dismounted and walked closer to examine the fire damage. This wasn't an accident. Someone soaked those barn walls with coal oil before setting the blaze. One of the deputies, a young man named Peterson, spoke up nervously. "Sheriff, maybe we should focus on getting these folks to safety. The fire's still spreading." "Good point." Burke remounted his horse and looked down at the McCready family. "You've got relatives you can stay with? Friends who'll take you in?" Daniel and Ayanna exchanged glances. They had built friendships in the community over the years, but asking for shelter after their property had been attacked would put others at risk of similar retaliation. "We'll manage," Daniel said finally. "No, you won't." The new voice came from the darkness beyond the fire's glow. Mrs. Henderson rode into view on her old mare, her gray hair braided and her jaw set with determination. Behind her came her son Tommy, now 22 and recently married, leading a pack horse loaded with supplies. "Martha, you shouldn't be here," Sheriff Burke said. "If this is Fletcher's work, being seen helping the McCreadys could make you a target." "Let him try, Mrs. Mary," Henderson replied firmly. "Ayanna saved my life during the blizzard of '68. My family owes the McCreadys a debt that can't be repaid with mere words." Tommy nodded agreement. "We've got room in our root cellar. It's not fancy, but it's warm and dry and safe. You can stay as long as needed." John Wolfe felt a surge of gratitude toward the Henderson family, mixed with anger at the circumstances that made their kindness necessary. This was his home, the only life he had ever known. The thought of leaving it because of one man's hatred made his young heart burn with fury. "What about our land?" he asked. "Our crops? Everything we've built?" "The land will still be here when this trouble passes," Ayanna said gently, though John Wolfe could hear the uncertainty in her voice. "Sometimes tactical retreat is the wisest course of action." "That's what cowards do," John Wolfe shot back, immediately regretting the words when he saw pain flash across his mother's face. "No, son," Daniel said quietly. "That's what smart people do when they're outnumbered and outgunned. There's no shame in living to fight another day." As if to emphasize his point, the wind shifted suddenly, sending sparks toward the house. Within minutes, the roof caught fire, and they all stepped back as flames began consuming the home the McCready family had built together. John Wolfe watched 10 years of memories disappear into smoke and ash. The kitchen, where his mother had taught him to cook traditional Comanche foods alongside white man's recipes. The parlor where his father had read to him from books about faraway places. The workshop where he had learned to carve wood and mend leather and fix broken things. "I'm sorry," Sheriff Burke said, his voice heavy with regret. "I'll do everything I can to find who did this and bring them to justice." "Will you?" Ayanna asked, her tone carrying a challenge. "Even if the evidence points to prominent citizens who have friends in high places?" Burke met her gaze steadily. "I took an oath to uphold the law for everyone in this county. That includes you and your family." As dawn broke over the smoldering ruins, the small group prepared to leave the place that had been home. John Wolfe climbed onto the wagon seat between his parents, looking back at the blackened skeleton of their barn and the still-burning house. "Will we ever come back?" he asked. "I don't know," Daniel answered honestly. "But wherever we go, we'll go together. That's what families do." Ayanna reached over and took her son's hand. "Home isn't just a place, John Wolfe. It's the people you love and who love you back. As long as we have each other, we're never truly homeless." As their wagon rolled away from the destroyed homestead, John Wolfe made a silent promise to himself. Someday, when he was old enough and strong enough, he would make sure Tom Fletcher paid for what he had done. The boy who had learned to walk between two worlds was about to discover which world would claim his heart when the time for choosing finally came. The sight of their neighbors gathered at the property line, some offering help, others simply watching the destruction with satisfied expressions, burned itself into his memory like a brand. He was learning hard lessons about loyalty and hatred, about the price of being different in a world that demanded conformity. The education would serve him well in the trials yet to come. The morning of John Wolfe's 12th birthday arrived with the thunder of unshod hooves and the dust of destiny. Ayanna stood in the doorway of the Henderson root cellar that had sheltered her family for 8 months, watching 5 Comanche warriors crest the hill exactly as Running Bear had promised a decade before. Her son sat beside the creek, teaching his half-sister Mary the traditional way to weave grass into baskets, while 2-year-old Samuel played with wooden horses in the dirt. The children born of her marriage to Daniel had arrived like unexpected gifts, Mary with her father's green eyes and her mother's quick mind, Samuel with his stubborn streak that reminded everyone of his older brother. Now all 3 would witness the moment that might tear their family apart forever. "They've come," she called softly to Daniel, who was repairing harnesses in the shade of the old oak tree. He looked up, his face grave but unsurprised. "Right on schedule." "Papa, who are those men?" Mary asked, her 6-year-old voice bright with curiosity rather than fear. "They're John Wolfe's uncle and his friends," Daniel explained, setting down his tools. "They've come to see how tall and strong he's grown." John Wolfe had heard the horses too. He stood slowly, his 12-year-old frame already showing the height and lean muscle that would make him formidable as a man. His hair hung past his shoulders in the traditional style, but he wore the blue cotton shirt and denim pants that marked him as part of the white world too. Running Bear dismounted with the fluid grace of a man born to the saddle, his weathered face showing the passage of 10 hard years. The other warriors remained mounted, their horses dancing nervously as they scented unfamiliar territory. "Nephew," Running Bear said in Comanche, his voice carrying across the yard like distant thunder, "you have grown tall." "Uncle," John Wolfe replied in the same language, his pronunciation perfect despite years of speaking mostly English. "You honor us with your presence." The formal greeting pleased Running Bear, though his expression remained serious as he studied the boy who carried his brother's blood. John Wolfe stood straight and proud, meeting his uncle's gaze without flinching, the bearing of a young warrior, even if he had been raised among farmers and shopkeepers. "We have come for your answer," Running Bear said. "Will you ride with your people and learn the old ways, or will you stay with the whites and forget the blood that flows in your veins?" The question that had haunted the McCready family for years hung in the morning air like smoke from a signal fire. Ayanna felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she waited for her son's response. But John Wolfe didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked closer to his uncle, his movements careful and respectful. "Before I choose," he said, "I would ask something of you." Running Bear's eyebrows rose slightly. "Speak." "Last autumn, white men burned our home and drove us from our land because my mother is Comanche and they feared what that meant." John Wolfe's voice remained steady, though Ayanna could see the anger burning in his green eyes. "They attacked us like cowards in the night, destroying everything my family had built." "This surprises you?" Stone Wolf spoke from horseback, his scarred face showing contempt. "The whites have always been treacherous. It is their nature." "Some whites," John Wolfe agreed, "but others risked their safety to help us. The Henderson family took us in when we had nowhere to go. Mrs. Morrison brought us food and medicine. Even Sheriff Burke worked to find justice for what was done to us." "And did he find this justice?" Running Bear asked. "Tom Fletcher was arrested 3 months ago. He's in the territorial prison now, serving 5 years for arson and destruction of property." John Wolfe's smile was sharp as a knife blade. "Sometimes the white man's law does work, even for people like us." Ayanna watched this exchange with growing pride and growing fear. Her son was showing wisdom beyond his years, but she could see where his thoughts were leading. "You speak of justice," Running Bear said, "but what of honor? What of learning the warrior's path and the ways of your fathers?" I've been learning, John Wolfe replied. My mother taught me to track and hunt and read sign in the earth. She taught me the plants that heal and the rituals that honor the spirits. She taught me the language of our people and the stories of our ancestors. He paused, looking back at Daniel, who stood watching with quiet intensity. But my father, my white father, taught me other things too. How to read and write and do numbers. How to build things that last and fix things that break. How to keep his word even when it costs him dearly. Pretty words, Stone Wolf said dismissively. But words do not make a warrior. No, John Wolfe agreed. Actions do. Without warning, he spun and drew the knife from his belt in one fluid motion, sending the blade spinning through the air to bury itself in the trunk of the oak tree 30 feet away. The throw was perfect, the blade quivering in the exact center of a knot in the bark. The warriors exchanged glances, clearly impressed by the boy's speed and accuracy. My mother taught me that throw, John Wolfe said, walking to retrieve his knife. But my father taught me when not to use it. Running Bear dismounted and approached his nephew, studying the boy's face with new interest. Explain. A warrior's strength isn't just in his weapons or his courage in battle. It's in knowing when to fight and when to build, when to hold on to tradition, and when to adapt to changing times. John Wolfe met his uncle's eyes directly. My people, both my peoples, need bridges between worlds, not walls. And you think you can be such a bridge? I think I already am. John Wolfe gestured toward his half-siblings, who watched the proceedings with wide eyes. Mary speaks Comanche as well as English. Samuel knows the names of the 4 sacred directions and which plants make the best medicine. They're learning both ways because I teach them. Ayanna felt tears prick her eyes as she listened to her eldest son speak with such wisdom and certainty. This was not the confused boy she had feared might be torn between loyalties. This was a young man who had found his own path through the wilderness of identity. The old ways are dying, Stone Wolfe said bitterly. The buffalo are gone. The free lands grow smaller each year. Soon there will be nothing left but reservations and broken promises. Then we must plant new seeds in the ground that remains, John Wolfe replied. We must teach our children to be strong in whatever world they inherit. Running Bear was quiet for a long moment, weighing his nephew's words. Finally, he spoke. You refuse to come with us? I choose to stay with my family, John Wolfe corrected gently. All of my family. But I also choose to remain connected to my Comanche heritage. To visit when I can. To learn from the elders while they still live. To carry the stories forward to my own children someday. And if we forbid this? If we say you must choose one world or the other? John Wolfe's jaw tightened, and for a moment Ayanna saw his father's stubborn streak blazing in his young face. Then you would be no different from Tom Fletcher, he said quietly, demanding that people deny part of themselves to satisfy your fears. The words hung in the air like an arrow shot straight to its target. Running Bear's face darkened with anger, but before he could respond, an unexpected voice spoke up. The boy speaks wisdom. Everyone turned to see an ancient Comanche woman riding slowly toward them on a paint mare. Her hair was white as snow, her face lined with the geography of 9 decades, but her back was straight and her eyes sharp as obsidian. Grandmother, Running Bear said, his voice filled with surprise and respect. I told you I would come if you needed guidance. Grandson, the old woman dismounted with surprising agility and approached John Wolfe with the careful steps of one whose bones remember every winter they have survived. She studied the boy for a long moment, then reached out to touch his face with fingers gnarled by age but gentle as spring rain. You have your father's eyes but your mother's spirit, she said in English, startling everyone. I am Flying Eagle, mother of your grandfather Black Eagle. I have come to see what manner of man you are becoming. Honored grandmother, John Wolfe said, switching to formal Comanche as he knelt respectfully before the elder. Flying Eagle smiled, her ancient face creasing like leather left in the sun. Rise, child. Let me look at you properly. She circled him slowly, taking in his height, his bearing, the confident way he held himself. When she spoke again, her voice carried the authority of someone who had lived through the rise and fall of nations. This one will walk between worlds as easily as a hawk rides the wind, she announced. He will carry our blood into the future, but he will do it in his own way. This is as it should be. Running Bear looked stunned. But grandmother, the old ways will survive in new forms, as they always have. Flying Eagle's eyes sparkled with ancient wisdom. Do you think our people have never changed? Do you think we did the same things in the time of our great-grandfathers? She gestured toward John Wolfe, with one weathered hand. This boy knows who he is. He honors both sides of his heritage without being trapped by either. He will raise children who are proud of their Comanche blood but able to thrive in whatever world awaits them. She paused, looking around at the assembled group. That is not betrayal. That is survival. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of wind in the grass and the distant lowing of cattle. Finally, Running Bear nodded slowly. Then you have chosen your path, nephew. We will not stand in your way. But the choice is not finished, John Wolfe said, surprising everyone again. I want to spend the summer with you, to learn the warrior skills I'll need, and to hear the stories I should know. Then I want to come back and teach my brother and sister what I've learned. Flying Eagle clapped her hands together in delight. Now that is the wisdom of a true bridge builder. Take what you need from both sides and make something new and stronger. Running Bear looked to Ayanna and Daniel, seeing the mixture of pride and worry in their faces. Your parents must agree to this arrangement, he said. Daniel stepped forward, his voice steady despite the emotion Ayanna could see in his eyes. If John Wolfe wants to learn from his Comanche family, we won't stand in his way. But he comes back to us at summer's end. Agreed, Running Bear said solemnly. And when he returns, he will be welcome to visit our people whenever he chooses. As the warriors prepared to leave with their newest student, Ayanna pulled her son aside for a private word. Are you certain about this? She asked in Comanche. As certain as I can be about anything, John Wolfe replied. But I know who I am now, Ma. I'm your son and Pa's son and Black Eagle's son, all at the same time. I don't have to choose just one. Ayanna hugged him fiercely, breathing in the familiar scent of his hair and committing it to memory. Then go with my blessing and come back to us with new stories to tell. As she watched her eldest son ride away with his Comanche relatives, Ayanna felt Daniel's arms slip around her waist. Mary and Samuel pressed close to her sides, and for the first time in months, she felt complete. Think we'll see him again? Daniel asked quietly. I know we will, Ayanna replied, watching the dust cloud disappear over the horizon. He's got too much of both of us in him to stay away for long. The morning sun climbed higher, burning away the last traces of mist from the creek and warming the earth where three cultures had met and found common ground. In the distance, the sound of hammers and saws announced that construction had begun on their new cabin, built on land, deeded to them by Mrs. Henderson as a wedding gift for her son Tommy. Home, Ayanna reflected, wasn't just a place or a people. It was the courage to build something beautiful from the broken pieces of what came before. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, it was watching your children grow strong enough to build bridges where others saw only walls. The eternal blossom had found its soil at last, and the seeds it planted would bloom for generations yet to come.